Good morning. I'm just going to ask folks to take their seats because we have such a dynamic day. We're going to try to keep this moving on time. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tara McGuinness. I'm the executive director of something we call the Community Solutions Task Force at the White House. I could not be more delighted to be here. There's no group of people for whom I would be as sleepless as I am at this moment in time. I think it was said at the beginning that this is an incredible gathering, and I hope we make this as dynamic and conversational as possible. So I'm going to keep it really brief. This is a fantastic panel, but only bested by the folks who are sitting here in the audience. To my left, I have Ray Faustino, the CEO and founder of OneDegree, followed by Matt Klein, familiar to many of you, the executive director of the New York City Center for Economic Opportunity, Simone Brody, the executive director of What Works Cities, and Aden van Noppen, my colleague as a senior policy advisor at the Office of Science and Technology Policy. We are going to focus for the next 40 minutes on a conversation about proven solutions. I'm going to turn it over to the panelists in a moment just to ground us, taking a tip from Jim on concrete evidence-based things that are today working somewhere in America. So just to kick it off, we're going to start there. I want to talk and test a little bit about the scalability of the impact of some of these things, because I think to this question of decades of work in places, this has been going on since Bobby Kennedy and farther back. The federal government alone in 2014 spent $590 billion through states and local governments. So there's a ton of work to do to make progress at scale, and I really want to push on the idea of taking things that may be working in one part of one city or town and bringing them nationwide. And I would like to attempt to use the audience to scheme up a bit. So drink your coffee, you're on notice about what a blueprint would look like. This group of folks is as good a panel to conceptualize what a blueprint for addressing economic opportunity nationwide would be. So I'm going to put that to you all, but I'd also like folks in the audience to think about what big ideas this group might come up with. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over to Ray, and maybe just ask to go down the line. Give us a little more about who you are, what you're doing, and please, one concrete story. Tell us something we don't know about what's working.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ray Faustino, the CEO and founder of OneDegree. First of all, thank you to Elizabeth Mason for inviting me here today, this morning. OneDegree is a nonprofit, technology-driven organization, and we use technology to make it easy for low-income families to find and access critical nonprofit and social services in their community. I started this because I grew up as a low-income immigrant, and I struggled to find resources in my own community when I was living in Southern California. And I've spent my career actually across the freeway in East Palo Alto helping other low-income students graduate from high school and go off to college and try to find those resources as well. Every day we were trying to understand how to navigate the system of services that we were trying to find, and we were stuck using paper binders and spreadsheets and Microsoft Word to try to find these resources, and I thought that was absolutely horrifying and ridiculous. And so I decided to start OneDegree to do something about that. And with OneDegree, as I mentioned, we have a mobile and web platform that makes it easy for low-income families to find and access critical services in their communities. It's kind of like a Yelp for social services, and that's our first innovation. To date, we've had over 140,000 people in the last 4 years utilize our platform right here in our backyards in the Bay Area. And our second innovation is our resource database. We collect and maintain this resource database of community resources, and it's built and geared for low-income families and people who are looking for services for low-income families. And so it's really easy and accessible. We have over 10,000 resources in our database, and we're excited about that. And probably the third most exciting for me innovation that we're working on is how do we actually bring this technology to scale, because it is a technology platform. And so we're integrating our platform within systems. So we're partnered up with Los Angeles County Department of Health Services, and we're integrating our OneDegree platform into the system so we can have nurses, social workers, healthcare workers find resources as they're working with their clients. So that's just one very concrete idea that we have.
So if folks don't mind, maybe I'll mix it up and jump to the far end, picking up on this concept of data as a tool for reaching actual people, to my colleague Aden Van Noppen on the citizen services side.
Yeah. So as Tara said, I'm Aden Van Noppen, and I work at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, really applying data and technology to the work that we do with low-income communities. So for me, a lot of this work is about data as a tool for empowerment. So we're obviously in the digital age, we're swimming in troves of data, but the ability to create tools with that data is a form of privilege and of power. And there's such a thing as data poverty. So the sorts of collaborations that are required to build out tools that really help people to access resources doesn't happen automatically. So we've tried to create the conditions for that to happen through a project that we call the Opportunity Project. And this is really answering a call from the president to create more collaborations between the tech sector and government and end users and subject matter experts, because it's really at that intersection that we can solve hard problems. So we've facilitated the process of the creation of over 40 digital tools that help people to navigate resources locally. So we've engaged with teams like Redfin and Zillow, Fitbit, LinkedIn, who have built tools that do things like help low-income families identify affordable homes that are in close proximity to jobs, or help superintendents to identify equity gaps between schools. And they use federal and local open data to do this. And so what we've learned in terms of concrete outcomes is that the tech sector really wants to engage on these hard problems, but it's not always easy to do. And so same thing with government. Oftentimes we see that program managers and policymakers who aren't your typical digital people also see the potential of this new set of tools that we would have available to us if we had easy pathways to engage with the tech sector. And so we've tried to create those pathways that make it easier for that to happen by the federal government in this case, although you could do it with local government, articulating core priorities that really could be advanced through these collaborations with the tech sector. We put a call out, people respond to it, and then we put in the mix end users and subject matter experts so that you can really create the conditions for that sort of collaboration to happen. And we are moving into a new phase of how we see ourselves as stewards of our own data. So this is really coming back to that piece of it, where we curate combinations of data on access to resources. Instead of just sort of putting the data up there and praying that people will come and make meaningful tools with it that help people solve problems in their everyday lives, we see this as we should have a much more active role in that process. And in terms of what's been proven, to be honest, I think there's a lot more that we could do to track the outcomes of this. We're very early, and what we've seen is that we're creating these new sorts of relationships and new sorts of pathways, and we feel really good about the tools that have been built so far, but we want to continue to understand really what's the core impact on the lives of people who these tools are meant to benefit. So I'll leave it there.
Great. Matt, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Hi, folks. Good to be here. It really is such an important conversation, as Jim framed up, for this moment in time. Recognizing that we're connected to the long arc, important particularly to recognize now, I think. I run the New York City Center for Economic Opportunity, which is a unit in the mayor's office in the city of New York, which essentially tries to help the city use evidence to reduce poverty and do it in a number of different ways. We run an innovation fund that creates new ideas, tests them rigorously. If they work, aims to scale them up. If they don't work, end them and reallocate dollars to new ideas. We also use our evaluation capacity to support the testing and assessment of broad funding by the city. So to Jim's point, not only looking at the boutique of what new innovations, whether they work or don't work, but looking at the big, broad-scale funding streams of the city and trying to better understand which of those are effective and how can we reallocate to those funding approaches that work better for low-income folks. We're also increasingly invested in the use of administrative data for reasons I'm sure we'll discuss and that many of you are engaged in as well, to think about how do we use the data that government's already collecting to do things like targeting folks who ought to be getting benefits for which they're eligible, so that we can begin to make systemic the kind of innovations that Single Stop has pioneered. And we're increasingly also focused on the application of human-centered design in the development of governmental programs. Too often, programs are created at the government level by folks, if we're lucky, looking at evidence, and then if we're not lucky, just thinking about what services they think ought to exist, issuing an RFP and funding it without truly engaging the folks who are intended to be the beneficiaries of the program, and also without following and understanding the experiences of folks as they engage with those programs, so that we can iterate in response to folks' actual experiences, and so that programs can work as we intend and not as we hope. I think we as a room are privileged. I think she's juggling conferences, but Marian Edelman was here. And I think she points out that solutions to the challenges we're facing are not just going to come from the folks in this room looking at the data and trying to figure it out, but it's going to come from engaging with the folks whose lives we're aiming to help make better and to help them fulfill their full potential. So one example of an idea that emerged from a pilot that's now at scale is something called Cuny Asap, which is an initiative to increase the college success of students who are seeking two-year college degrees. And we know too often that is too low. At Cuny, it's averaged about 23%. And ASAP started with a cohort of 4,000 with randomized control trial, cost-benefit studies, and cobbled together a number of things that were not crazily out of the box, but that were brought together in one place, paying for books and transportation, ensuring that students took classes in cohorts, providing specialized tutoring and guidance. And that model doubled the graduation rate of folks according to the randomized control trial. And so as a result, the mayor is investing heavily, moving from 4,000 pilots to 25,000 students, investing $85 million to really boost the number of graduates at Cuny. So that speaks to a little bit bridging the gap between the innovation in the boutique level and thinking about what it takes to actually scale. But I'll name just one more, which is that looking at a poverty model that New York uses, which is essentially a local version of supplemental poverty rate, we modeled what it would be if the minimum wage had been $15 in 2013, and saw that if the wage had been $15 then, about 750,000 people would have been above the poverty or near poverty rate in New York City. And so that speaks to the power that broad-scale policy, not just a particular program, but broad-scale policy can have on the kind of issues that we're facing as well.
I appreciate you surfacing the two twinned, Matt, that both there's the getting from 4,000 to 25,000, but also the complementary nature of federal or statewide actions in some of this. And so I want to pick up on that and come back in a bit, but first I want to give Simone a chance to get in here on what works, since that's basically in your title.
Yeah, great. So I'm the executive director of What Works Cities at Results for America, and What Works Cities is an initiative that is partnering with cities around the country, 55 to date, mid-sized cities, helping to build the capacity of staff in cities to be better users of data and evidence to make better decisions in government. And I think that through our work in our first year and a half, we've learned a tremendous amount about cities. Number one is how incredibly nimble actually they can really be as change agents. And as we think about what that means, especially going forward in using cities as pilots for innovation that can be spread around the country. And I think number two is that actually city staff, all the way down to frontline staff, foster care agents, corrections officers, are really underutilized innovators in city government. And so to that, I think the example I will give is how city governments are starting to think about sort of creating continuous improvement programs within the city. And I think they do two things. Number one is that they really empower staff members across the city to think about how can I make my city agency or my role and my work better and create really dramatic impacts, but also they frankly provide professional development to city staff that really is lacking in the field. And so one great example of that is Denver's Peak Academy. So what they've done over the last 3 years is trained 50% of the staff in the city on strategies from everything like behavioral science. So how do you use and think about user-centered design when you're creating your services? So actual residents in the community that need it know about them and show up when you text them about the programs, all the way to how do you really democratize data so that all city staff members can actually use and look at, understand the stories that the data is telling. And through that, they've empowered thousands of city staff members to make improvements in things that they're doing. So things like they've reduced the amount of time to get an approval for a foster parent from what was a year to now 3 months. They've reduced the amount of time when somebody applies for food assistance. A food assistance worker did this training and then went back and took what was a 3-week process to get food assistance up to 24 hours. And so I think thinking about how are we innovating at every part of the spectrum and across the board in cities is really exciting to think about how that empowers folks in cities to do their work. And in Denver is one city that's now saved tens of millions of dollars, but more importantly has provided many more services to residents than would have seen them before.
So maybe I'd like to pick up there, Simone, and Matt, you service this as well, of like scale solutions that are really working somewhere, but I want to press on the capacity to take this city, outside of one city agency to citywide. I think, Ray, you were talking about your aspirational growth in the number of the 40,000 people who are doing this in the Bay Area. What would it take to make that, 400,000? What would that take to get even bigger? So this can be both opportunities or obstacles. I'd like to just press a little bit on what you see from in the trenches as the opportunity or obstacles to go bigger on these aspects.
But one thing that I think is sometimes the model in our mind that's often better than the standard, but it's not necessarily a full answer, is you try something, if we measure it, it works, okay, let's scale that, and the opportunity is just make it bigger, make it bigger, make it bigger. And I think that's definitely better than just doing stuff and not knowing if it works. But there's another model that says, let's constantly be looking at what we're doing and improving it, as opposed to that we have a model and now it's just about scaling that individual model. And I think that feels particularly timely for the advances around big data and analytics and the greater sophistication and lower cost of technology for everybody to get better at, to get more ongoing feedback about what we're doing and whether that's having good results. The behavioral economics stuff is a good example of that, where they do simple things like redesigning forms to be more appealing to get take-up. And you can send out 2 forms at once and see which one works better. But there's more and more examples of thinking about how we use administrative data to track whatever we're doing and make improvements on that, in addition to the scaling the proven model with fidelity.
And jump in here, Ray or Simone, where are the gaps? Is it the absence of data that would allow you to know where the opportunities are? Is it, I think as Jim surfaced, the innovation pilot was really a drop in the ocean of the general federal dollars going in the education space, but I'd like to press a little deeper on where the obstacles lie.
Go ahead.
No.
I think that one big question we're still struggling with is who does it work for? So I think sometimes we do pilots and we are like, this works. And so we look at averages, and cities and all organizations are still struggling with disaggregating. Now we sort of disaggregate by race, but actually who do these programs work for and who are they reaching and who aren't they? And so as we try to think about that and figure out what does that mean for scale? So how do we want to scale it across the city? Do we want to scale it in certain communities? How do we think about what services and what programs are right for what communities? And I think the value of big data from an inclusion perspective is it actually really helps you understand who are you serving and who aren't, and how do you get this out to everybody.
And for us, one of the biggest gaps is data, and that's why I'm so excited about what Aden's working on, is really trying to harness the power of data in government. And what we found is that in the nonprofit sector and social service sector, there are literally thousands of pockets of proprietary information about social services housed in like a 211 database or a city agency database or a nonprofit spreadsheet or literally like, again, Microsoft Word documents or PDFs. And so there's not one unifying regional, state, or even national database of nonprofit and social services. So as a nonprofit organization, what we're excited about is that we're creating that now. We're creating this national database of nonprofit services that anyone can access. It's free, it's open to the public. We have an API that anybody can use to build additional apps on top of that. And so we're really trying to free up and democratize this information. And what we can do with that is start seeing the supply and demand of resources in our community. So for an example, just in the last 3 weeks since the election, we've seen a 400% increase in the number of people searching for legal services like immigration services. We've seen a 41% increase in the number of people who are searching in Spanish. And that's the kind of supply and demand of local community resources that we can use at a community level, at a municipal level, to inform how can we provide more services for our community in a real-time basis, not on an annual or 5-year basis.
So I want to open it up here in a minute to the broader group, and so I'll put the mic runners on notice. I think data and the possibility of our time and the tools that we have today and some that we couldn't imagine is incredibly important. It's striking how some of the solutions are straightforward. This is true with single stop. I think the paying for books is not like rocket science. Or the traveling in a cohort with people who have like challenges is not rocket science. So I maybe want to open it up in the space of where do these modern tools collecting data allow us to have, and this could be from the audience as well, straightforward solution sets that are pretty intuitive, similar to what you described in the Denver space. I'll offer one up. We found that where federal community-based programs were working, there was a leader on the federal side and a leader on the local side. It's not very fancy. And so the similar investments that are happening in Denver, we're making in career leaders in the federal government on basic tools like how to measure what works or connecting to what are modern tools you could use to connect to your peers at other agencies. So I want to make sure that in the possibility of big data, which helps us identify some of these choke points, that we don't forget the kind of intuitive things like it's just way too hard to sign up, or the form is not in English, or the form is 75 pages long. We have some folks from the ad hoc work here where these very simple intuitive processes choke us up. So I'd love to open it up now for either on the scalable solution space, but especially on the lighter discovery that some of these modern tools allow us. If there's questions from the audience, maybe we'll start to get it going there. Otherwise, I have a wide range of questions to probe these panelists on. I'll jump back in, because I can't see where the mics. Oh, here in the back, yeah.
And we've been fortunate enough to be a part of the What Works initiative. One of my questions is, in city government, a lot of our employees don't actually have the data analytics, the data science, or the visualization skills. How do you start incorporating those actual skill sets? We just don't have $175,000 to hire a data scientist, right? So for City of San Jose, we have no data scientist, but we need those skills. So how does that, what strategies have you seen work to help develop those skills in city staff?
Yeah, sure, I'll start. And I think that the fact that it's true in San Jose is really interesting because we always hear from cities like Jackson, Mississippi, and Anchorage, we don't actually have a network of folks that can support it, and the fact that even in San Jose, it's hard to find a network of folks that can support some of the deeper analytic work, I think is a really good point. And one thing that we've seen cities really do is instead of thinking about how do we bring technologists into city government and make them public servants, how do we actually think about how do you make the folks that are in public service that have committed their careers to this and provide them with a benefit, which is training and upskilling them to become data scientists or really strong consumers of data. And there are some really interesting programs now. So a lot of the partners in What Works Cities are providing certification courses and other kinds of programs that are helping to train existing city staff. And that's, I think, a really exciting opportunity that we're going to see more of. Just in the last 2 months, I've heard of 2 startups, actually, that are going in to provide professional development, one in New York City, to staff around this. And I think that is a really interesting opportunity to now take advantage of. Frankly, the question is, how do we make sure, just as we're thinking about how do we provide these resources to residents, how do we make sure cities know about the opportunities to apply for grants and get access to these kinds of programs? But there are more and more where existing city staff can be trained on some of this work, including What Works Cities.
And I would also jump in there and say that I think it's important to think about the skill sets that are in your community to do that work as well, and being bold about asking your local tech sector to step in and work with you to do data analytics, to do visualization in the meantime. And there are so many cities that don't have the capacity or the funds, right, to hire new people, or in the meantime as people are getting trained. I think there's a real opportunity for cities to be more bold and think bigger about how to engage the tech sector. And the tech sector wants to engage with us oftentimes, but we don't necessarily put out in the open, these are the things that really would help us most and that would be our priorities. And I think there's a big opportunity for us to do that beyond the typical sort of hackathon model. People want to engage in more substantive ways with us.
Matt, I saw you nodding your head, and I think we can't underscore this capacity question enough, both on the internal aspect and the external aspect. The ability to operationalize any of these innovations takes the capacity to operationalize them. So I think this is like an important piece for us as we carry forward for the rest of today and tomorrow, that in order to bring some of these pieces to scale, capacity seems like at the center place. I saw a question here in the middle. Oh, so we got 2. Let's do 1 and 2.
Okay. So good morning. My name is Almaz Nagash. I am the managing director for Step Up Silicon Valley. It's an initiative of Catholic Charities dedicated to reduce poverty in Silicon Valley. So I'm just going to bring you back to a community-based data integration, data collection system. We are working with 5 organizations to test whether 5 organizations can actually work together to reduce poverty. One of the challenges has always been, how do we get dispersed data to get together, and then at least people don't have to enter data twice. Luckily, Cisco Systems gave us a seed funding to start to test this pilot project. What I think I'm finding through that process is, how do we actually engage more of the corporations to really help go a little bit deeper, not necessarily all on the higher level. I'm actually going very, very micro, and a small group of people can actually make a difference in the community. We're asked by foundations and philanthropists to measure what we do. And to do that, you really have to enter data, and you have to measure whether people are actually really getting out of poverty. It's easier to give money, but to understand whether people are getting out of poverty is a different story. So what I'd like to ask you is, at the very, very basic level, what is it that we need to do to engage the philanthropists, the corporations, the nonprofits, and the governments together to really work to figure out how to get people out of poverty? It's kind of, it's a vicious cycle. You want to do one thing, and then you have a hole, and there's so many gaps. And I think we're trying to close one small gap, and then I found through that a lot of bigger gaps. So I'm trying to get some insight from all of you what we might do. And I'm here in the Valley. Thank you.
Great. Maybe we'll take the second question in the middle, and then I'll turn it over to the panelists or audience, the expertise in the audience for these 2 questions.
Yeah, hi. Collection of the data is important, but I get concerned when we have data, the interface between the data and people and how they operate on it. So at 2 levels. One is when you get the information that we give, say, people in the community of what to do, how do we help them support them to both understand it and to do it, whether it's a behavioral economic strategy that Matt mentioned or some others. Who's thinking about the interface of the human and the technology? At another level, between the data and the city, it's the same thing. You're putting the data, but who are those people and how can they be helped to use the data creatively? It's not just an algorithm that you get data and it tells you what to do. There has to be a process, and I'm just curious about, at both of those levels, the interface between data and technology and the people that it's supposed to inform.
Fantastic. I'm going to ask, look back to the panel or anyone else who'd like to jump in the conversation on the two questions. Take kind of the world universe to bring the data to scale, and this side on human beings. Matt, I see you want to jump in.
Well, these are tough questions, but they're at the heart of it, because you get into the data-driven, evidence-based world and you think it's so clean, and you just look at the numbers and the studies, and then you'll figure. In fact, the data's messy. The data, organizations are not collecting the data. If they are collecting the data, they're using the same words to mean different things, like job and placement will mean two different things, so you can't compare job placement rates. People are holistic, so I'm pleased to hear about the collective impact effort. Holistic with multiple needs, so a one-shot, one-model program is not necessarily going to be transformative for folks' lives or their families. So these are the messy worlds in which we live that's important to keep in mind as we're thinking about fancy data-driven solutions. I would just say that the insights that you're developing on the ground with groups who are struggling with the data, the key things for me, and it gets to the question about capacity too, is being very clear about what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve, being clear across all the constituencies and stakeholders about how we're defining those outcomes, including with those words, and so that when we are capturing that data and that data moves around, it's clear to folks what it is that they're looking at. And every stage in that chain, it can break. And so the data scientist needs to be paired with the subject program person. Or if there's no data scientist, just make sure we're clear about outcomes, and then we're going back and using those outcomes to engage with the providers who are delivering the services.
I'd ask others to jump in. I'll surface one or two pieces myself. A lot of the data when we were working on rolling out the Affordable Care Act demonstrated that one cohort of people was in no way just going to sign up for health insurance just with technology. They needed to talk to a human being. So sometimes to this question of interface, the data leads you to the fact that some of this requires deeper kind of community organizing. But do others want to get in either on the question of bringing people together on the measurable and linking data sets or the data interface?
Sure. I think to the question on the bringing people together, one thing that we've seen a lot with cities is there can be almost a contentious relationship between cities and the service providers that provide services and the work. And I see folks from the Government Performance Lab at the Kennedy School here, they just did a project in Seattle around homelessness where they were working with homeless vendors for years. They've been collecting basically activity-based data, and they had no idea if the work that the homeless providers were doing was actually reducing poverty. And so what they did was they decided to create a pilot where they actually tracked outcomes. So instead of tracking how many individuals are being provided showers every day, they're now actually tracking how these providers move individuals to stable living. And they were frankly very nervous about bringing this proposal to providers. And when they did bring it to their provider community, the provider community was so excited actually about the fact that they were now going to be able to track outcomes and see the outcomes of their peers, because they're all mission-driven, trying to get to the same outcomes that the city was, but had no insight into what this looked like. And so I think it was an interesting lesson to us in how do you actually think about these relationships as partnerships versus transactionally, and I think that's true for the philanthropic and private sector community too, is can we think about all of the organizations in a community that are working to solve a problem and actually sit around the table and say, what are you best positioned to provide as a private sector organization without the same constraints as government, and what are we best positioned to provide, and actually thinking about that in a collaborative way that sounds frankly idealistic sometimes, but we've seen it really effective at the local level, and I think you can think about how to scale that up more broadly.
I'll just quickly build on that in terms of thinking about it as partnerships instead of just kind of one-off transactional relationships. think authentic collaboration and user-centered work is really, really hard. And it's easy to do that and kind of give lip service to it, to the second question of kind of how you connect the data and the human side of things. And so I think one of the things that we've learned is that if you do some of the work of creating these cohorts that really level the playing field across end users and subject matter experts, the policy people, the technology people, you can start to get some of that culture change and build not only the specific relationships, but also the notion that it's not, this is what it actually looks like to engage with end users in an iterative way with the human side and to break down some of those walls. So I think that sometimes you really have to do a lot of work to cultivate that in the early stages.
I would add just one note of caution on that, is that what was important actually about the Seattle work was that they decided not to, right now, pay based on those outcomes. And I think sometimes what's happening is we're conflating this idea of accountability with the partnership, and as we've learned with the Common Core and other things, is that it's actually really hard to both introduce a new sort of way of working and accountability at the same time. And so I think it is important to start these as real meaningful partnerships, which means sometimes it's not going to work and we're not going to penalize you for that in year one, and maybe 3 or 4 years from now when we have some established best practices, we can think about sort of the more advanced concepts of pay for performance. But if it's going to be a real partnership, you have to be willing to fail with that partner up front before we sort of think about the consequences.
I want to turn it back to the audience questions here because we're coming on the end, but I see one in the front and one in the back. Maybe we'll collect the two. Go for it.
Good morning, and thank you. My name is Carla Mays. I run a consulting firm in San Francisco, Mays Civic Innovation, focused on innovation economy and smart cities. One of the things that we often we talk about is data and everything, but we don't look at barriers to entry and innovation versus evidence-based. So when it comes to, I've been a civic hacker for probably about 4 or 5 years and worked with a lot of civic hackers across the country. The issue is like trying to, bring those innovations to light, right? And you're coming up with something new, but you're being asked to have all this data or these proven points, and you just don't, there's no money for you to take and scale things. Who do you work with? The community foundation goes, go get, $25,000 before you can open up a project fund. I mean, there are real, barriers to this. And then looking at, how do we get past those barriers and looking at, we're talking about being here in Silicon Valley where we lack women and people of color. And, these are the real issues with this is looking at the financing. And so I have a lot of folks like on Twitter and stuff, they're like, I wish I could be there, to talk about this, and will you please bring this up? Because we're talking about data, but as we know, data has its own biases and issues, and who are the researchers that are collecting it to begin with? So how do we address these issues in being able to make a level playing field? I'm loving the work of Frida Kapor and Mitch Kapor and their new center in Oakland. And I mean, how are we going to get more models to that? And I've just returned from P3 in Toronto, with the public-private partnership, and in Canada and other countries, they get a chance to get startup grants and startup funding to be able to do this work. So then they have those partnerships already made. We in the U.S. don't have those things, and we're innovators at a disadvantage. So how are we addressing those things? Thank you.
Barriers to entry, and maybe I'll collect one more question before we turn it back to the panel here.
I'll be quick. Thank you. No, I'm only kidding, sorry. I'm a social impact filmmaker and a social venture capitalist working with the United Nations. 2 things were triggered. One of them is Richard Branson created, I believe, Virgin Unite because his observation was there are myriad nonprofits out in the world doing good work, but they don't do great work because they compete and they don't unify. That brings me to my second. You talked about messy data. More and more data, more messy. How do you interpret it? Dashboards. Bringing those 2 concepts together, and the Carbon War Room was an attempt at that in the environmental space. What about evolving collaboration and a unified dashboard to begin to paint the picture of all the inequity, all the resources, and bring some nice machine learning into that so we can begin to see who needs help, and more importantly, who is offering help and how to maximize that. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So barriers to entry and dashboard somewhere Mayor Garcetti is like standing up and clapping, I feel confident. Do folks want to jump in here?
Yeah, so with the barriers to entry, that's a real thing, and I faced that directly when I started OneDegree. So I started OneDegree about 4.5 years ago in 2012, and our first year budget was less than $30,000. And it's very difficult to run a brand new innovation in a nonprofit entity. And so what I had to do is be really, so I guess I should first say that I implore people and foundations and the philanthropic community to really think about and work on risk capital for nonprofit organizations, because this is where the innovation is coming up from in our community, and how can we lift up what works. And so our organization has been fortunate and very strategic about how we can navigate this. In our first year, I spent less than $500 to create the prototype of OneDegree. I worked with 2 volunteers. I'm not an engineer, but I scrapped something together, a prototype together, and that proved and demonstrated that we needed to take the next step, which was to hire a CTO, and on, kind of like in a scaffolding pattern. But that was a really difficult road, and I watched my for-profit startup counterparts raise millions of dollars in seed capital off of a napkin sketch. And that is truly inequity at its finest. And so when we're working on how do we bring technology to our most vulnerable communities, we need to really infuse risk capital in our sector to make that happen.
I want to ask, anyone want to get in on dashboards, but we're right at the end here, so I'm going to ask, if you had a magic wand, panelists, or anyone who'd like to jump in, one major or 2 or 10, what would you do to take us from some of these concepts that work to scale? So, dashboards and or big dream, big recommendations for America's mayors.
Am I first?
Sure, Aden.
Come on, Tara. Yeah, I'll go for magic wand. Although dashboards love it, and if there's anyone in the room who feels like you're in a position to help create common data standards across cities, please do that. We hear all the time from cities that it would be really fabulous if they could, and if all of us could really, help to amplify and unlock the power of data by doing that. But in terms of a magic wand, in addition to that happening, I would say, it kind of goes to the point that I mentioned before about really thinking in very bold ways about how we ask the tech sector to step up. And what we are starting to learn is that for whatever reason, the tech sector and people with significant tech talent and significant platforms really want to engage on hard problems with us. And we can make it a lot easier for that to happen. Sometimes it takes asking, and it takes helping to line up the pieces and creating those pathways of communication. And so, I would just say, whether you're from the tech sector, think bold about how you might engage with us on hard problems, and us, I mean sort of defined broadly. Some of us won't be in federal government very, very soon, but at the local level, which is a place that I really have a magnetic pull and passion about. But also, if you are more from the philanthropic side or from the policymaker side, please also think bold about what those partnerships could look like and what you can ask for.
Lightning round, Simone.
Sure. I think what we've learned is that actually 80% of the problems our cities face are very similar, and one city has solved a problem that another city across the country has just begun to think about, and lots of clearinghouses exist, but actually that's not how people learn and adapt solutions. So how are we thinking about breaking down the silos first across cities and then from city, state, and federal level, because there's a lot of learning that has happened that is not circulating as much as it should. And so how are we bringing folks together? How are we thinking about different platforms for communication to really share some of these learnings, I think is an exciting opportunity.
I wave my magic wand and have mayors and other levels of government do what Jim called on us all to do, which is invest more in performance management, funding what works, and funding entities at the local level, nonprofits, startups, local governments to have the capacity to do that. So I think without that kind of capacity, we won't be able to build the magic dashboards, but with it, I think many of us are aiming in that direction.
So we see scale through local government, and one of our big bets is that OneDegree should be bigger than just here in the Bay Area and bigger than just in California. And how can we reach folks in Nashville and New Orleans and New York? And so my magic wand for mayors is to consider checking out platforms like OneDegree and how can we bring these technologies and tools to your communities? Because we'd love to be there, and that's one of our goals is to be a nationwide platform.
So Ray, meet Simone and Matt. New York City is coming next. Simone's working in at least 10 What Works cities. I think we're at time. I want to thank our panelists. I want to challenge us to take some of these ideas through the next 2 days, including we very briefly touched on decommissioning what doesn't work. We focused on what works since it's first thing in the morning. But please, thank you to the audience and thank you to this incredible panel.
Thank you.